So just before we play this clip, first I just want to say it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I thought a lot about it in preparation to this, saying, what design stripes do I have? And so when I walked in, I told Joel that in the spirit of craft and integrating craft and design, I'm first trained in the modernist tradition where Corbusier, Kahn, and Frank Lloyd Wright were visiting India. And as a little schoolboy over my summer, my father said, well, a little like the chair that you're not allowed to sit on in the clip. As a baby, I used to sleep on the Charles Eames chair at a family friend's house. So I learned to make the Eames chair from scratch because it wasn't steam molded ply, it's actually ply built in molds. And so I greatly respect the depth of thought and effort that goes into the pieces on which we sit. And I think there is direct relevance to the future of humanity as crafted in a sustainable future in the hands of design, because there is thought to detail. And I'll try to open that up in the context of cities. But to lay the ground for the scale of the challenge and what is happening above the European Union, as you pointed, and after this clip, I would like to say why we think Copenhagen was a grand success. We were there at the invitation of the mayor then, along with the C40 delegation as scholars. That was the sort of a small attached part of the big leadership delegation. But the video clip here will walk you through a little bit of both, in my view, role of design, and also a brief history of the climate negotiations in the global context. So if you bear with me, this is about 2 minutes. This could have been the end of my talk, because now you can stand up, leave, and design sustainable futures. As you can see, the designers have tremendous ability to bring together what is rather complex and tough negotiations. And those little quotations that you see along there, actually the events that occurred in Copenhagen are also represented in there. If the price of oil changes, I would like to be compensated, was one of the early statements made by an important country at that point in time. But just as we open up to the talk that I have on climate change in cities, I just want to say that I left Copenhagen with Copenhagen, as it was called in that stage, with great hope, because two big things happened there in my mind. One, that, and I think my colleagues will speak more to it, that the United States, which until then was less so engaged in the process, had Obama represented there, and to me that was a dramatic change in of what had been happening the last couple of years, and that we have rarely seen a large global agreement without US leadership actively engaged in it that has sustained over time. And so having the United States on the table involved had further raised and perhaps raised expectations to the point that they were a little, maybe it was a little early in the process. I am hopeful for Paris. I think we will see something coming solid. But in Copenhagen, the developed countries and the developing countries did have a candid conversation towards the end. The second piece that came from there, which to me was critical, was further solidarity and effort towards action by cities. And cities were there, and when I say cities, I mean C40, but also the role of states, as in, the governor from California was there, but his counterparts from around the world were there. Anything that was not representing the national leadership has gone out and voluntarily acted on this. In that context, we as scholars have been aggregating knowledge to bring it to their attention so that they could do this better. Very often we have asked for what knowledge they need, and the work I present to you is a collaborative exercise of 100 scholars from 50 cities around the world. If we can go back to the previous slide. Why do we care about cities as a role of solution providers? In my view, starting from design of a small chair and working my way through the policy arena, I stopped at cities because I think that's the finest pieces of design that humanity has ever done. It's a meta solution of systems coming together, brought together beautifully. And if you look at the migration and the presence of people and the choice people are making, we have crossed the halfway mark in global humanity living in cities. So half the world's population now lives in cities. In the next couple of decades, we will see almost a doubling of the global population of cities. Much of that is in settlements of the poor within cities, in rapidly urbanizing Africa and rapidly urbanizing Asia. That is one important sort of rationale to look at cities because people live in there. But if you look at the global emissions also, a big proportion of global carbon emissions come from cities, and cities are highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change simultaneously. So they are sort of at the heart of energy consumption, but they are also at the heart of the risks associated with climate change. And if you look at the global assessments of knowledge, there's a lot of knowledge on climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, another acronym, which you will learn more about or may already be familiar with, has put the knowledge on climate change together for the world leaders to sort of use that as a knowledge base in their policy debates, in their negotiations, and finally to an outcome. But what we find is that much of the action is at the city level, and cities have unique characteristics. Cities have urban heat island effects, cities have people operating in them, but they also have big proportion of global wealth concentrated, economic activity concentrated, increasingly poverty concentrated. They are often by the coast, and if they are not along the coast, then they are along river deltas, because proximity to water was a big consideration in the original siting of cities, in the design of cities. These special characteristics allow for an emphasis on knowledge that caters specifically to these conditions. And because cities were acting at this in dramatic ways, and C40 is a classic example of that, and we think Copenhagen is a little like utopia, because things happen there like they should everywhere else. But not every geography has the ability, the opportunity, and the conditions to make this happen as swiftly and as ambitiously. But we found in different ways cities are acting on this globally. So we put together the state of the knowledge on climate change in cities. This is an ongoing effort, and I walk you through some of the key elements of that. If we look at global carbon emissions, the ambassador and Joel both have mentioned 25 as a landmark year commitment. Here the scale of those towers are showing the level of commitment to reducing carbon emissions that various cities are voluntarily making around the world. This is really a classic example of where there is no binding agreement. This is not legally mandated by these cities. They are offering this as their step forward. This allows for their countries to make more ambitious targets because the key cities in these countries are making incredibly ambitious commitments on which they are acting. And indeed, New York is one of the world's largest cities that's a front runner on this. We have had the fortune of Mayor Bloomberg. In this period, we have seen transition of the leadership. It has gone from the mayor of Toronto, the previous mayor of Toronto, to Mayor Bloomberg, and the leadership has just moved to the mayor of Rio de Janeiro. So the leadership of C40 keeps traveling, and with that travels the message in the national and the regional governments around the world. I just quickly present to you our leadership council. It represents leaders from around the world, from every region, every continent, and we have Joel on our leadership group in North America up here. We have a variety of scholars who are New York based, who have helped facilitated, created the documents that laid the ground for the original NPCC, the New York Panel on Climate Change, which informs Plan NYC in a deep way, has informed a variety of actions that New York City has taken, and weathered the storm of Sandy in ways that I think often went unnoticed, because there was critique about what failed, but there was little attention given to the resilience of New York. When similar events occur in other geographies around the world, do we realize the extent to which loss of life happens? In Haiyan, in the Philippines, on early counts, at least 4,000 people have lost their lives, 4 million people have been displaced. So the scale of action and preventive measures that cities are taking sometimes gets understated, so I just draw that to your attention. Our effort is an open effort where we invite leading scholars and practitioners to engage in the process of offering cutting-edge knowledge from their own territory. So we have over 450 scholars and cutting-edge practitioners working on these issues. Some of our New School students have engaged in the process, but what was amazing was the Dean of Parsons, who, much to my surprise, sat right. Your dean sat through our workshop for 3 days, and I was like, I can only empathize with what he would have to go through to catch up with responding to all your emails and everything else. So if you didn't get an instant response from your dean, it was probably because he was caught in these busy meetings like this of scholars bringing the knowledge together so that better cities can be designed with the knowledge that is coming from cities like Copenhagen, like New York, the C40 members, but many small cities around the world too. The way the knowledge assessment was structured is really in 3 broad parts, but what we said was that we need to understand how risk is conceptualized and how does it really impact this artifact of grand design, the city. And then what does climate science tell us specifically for cities? We know climate science as we understand it for the world, for continents, we understand it for forests and agriculture. What does this mean for cities per se? That kind of science has informed the response of New York City. The New York City response is actually based on the work of my colleagues, Cynthia Country here, but she's very much part of the process, leads this process. And within that, we unpack this along each of the key sectors, energy, water, transport, and then we bring it together back again as a meta system through land use and governance. These may sound like a little complicated words, but they are quite simple as you begin to engage in the process. We always do a blend of these things. How many of you took the metro or the subway to come in here? Me too. So, everyday choices matter, and when they are available, and so how many of you biked here? So it is risky, Ambassador, to bike in New York, and the bikers can be risky for pedestrians too, I'm learning. But there is dramatic change happening everywhere, and we have to be open to that. I'll walk you through quickly through these ideas and then open it up. Just in the conception of risk, and in this I'll take a moment what we did, and a key contribution we made in this space, was to say that climate scientists who tell us about what has happened in the past, historic climate, looking at historic climate data and making projections into the future, tell us what are the threats or the hazards that are going to be imposed on a city. Think about it as a hammer hitting down on a piece of rock, right? So the external pressure on cities, and then let's replace the rock with a hard-boiled egg or just an egg. So when the hammer falls on a rock versus an egg, the outcome is dramatically different, right? For a moment, you may not think New York City is a rock, but New York City stood as a rock in the impacts of Sandy. What has happened in Haiyan was not as solid as a rock. And that difference we capture in vulnerability, which is to say, what is the difference between the kinds of impacts of different kinds, based on the nature of design, nature of the composition of cities. And then there's a third piece, which is where you sit, which is agency, which is where every choice and decision that is being made about these issues can make that soft egg into a hard-boiled egg, into a, if you dip it in nitrogen, probably we would get it hard as a rock, right? Bad analogy, but I hope it sticks in your head. I used to give the baby analogy, but that sometimes rubs. But it's important to keep in mind that you as those, when Joel said, designers as those playing a critical role in conceiving the future or the exercise of futuring, we should not think of agency, and I saw your syllabus says creative agency. Policymakers have agency. Sometimes it's not creative enough. You don't lack creativity. And the science piece, just to quickly, Cynthia does this so much better, but if you see the black lines up there in these graphs, the y-axis is temperature, the x-axis is time. So thinking horizontally is time, vertically is temperature. And the black lines are historical data about 100 years, so you see trends. And then there are 65 models which project this, in 48 models which project this into the future. And there's a secular increase in temperature. We do this for 12 plus 4 cities, about 16 cities in the text. But our new school students have applied this to about 50 cities around the world. So I wanted to say, why are my students? We are coming close to your 94 number, 30 plus 50. And then cities, as we know, are organized through systems. And I'll just briefly touch on transport, energy, and water. But once we understand what this risk means for cities, how it varies, what does this mean for water supply? If you move from New York to Lagos, 70% of the population is in slums and doesn't get water when they open the tap in the routine way that we think about it. So it works through informal systems. Those systems respond very differently to these threats. But it's just important to keep in mind that water services for folks around the world varies dramatically, so the solutions will vary dramatically. If we think of transportation, some transportation's up in the sky, beautiful colors, and sometimes it's down underground. And that makes dramatic difference in how you respond to these things. Design changes in the MTA and preparedness in the MTA allowed the MTA to shut down. It takes 7 hours to shut down the MTA. The MTA was preventively shut down in the wake of Sandy and therefore could bounce back in a couple of days. Otherwise, the extent of damage to just the assets in the MTA would have been dramatically different. If we bike to work, does the systems of the city allow us to actually use the bikes as a safe way of transportation? You've gone with your children. I, as a child, went on a two-wheeler which has inspired one of the world's smaller cars. I'm born in central India. My neighbors had 2 kids, and they decided that when they would go out in the evening that they would take me along because I was a cute kid, apparently. So I was popular in my neighborhood. So I went along, but we were actually on a two-wheeler and 5 people on a two-wheeler. So one of the major Indian corporations that makes automobiles, the new generation said, but that doesn't seem to be a safe way to travel, so let's make a $2,500 car so that low-income families can afford it. Of course, now that's a nightmare on the emission side. So very quickly, one kind of solution evolves into another kind of problem. In social science, sometimes we call these wicked problems, but with climate, we have like a super wicked problem, because when you solve something, it may show up in another way. So systems thinking in this is very important. On the energy sector, we hear a lot about coal, but we must keep in mind also that these are fuels that are sometimes used by extremely poor people. Out here is coal being produced for small town households in China. How do families that are relying on this to cook their dinner opt out of coal if this is the only thing they can afford? So and that's where the role of reimagining these things from scratch lies in your lap. It's an unprecedented opportunity to rethink the way we do everyday life. Yes, if we can light this room in equivalent ways with the mighty sun, that would be a great way to start. And that would have required us, of course, to be meeting in the tropics. I'm thinking of natural light and the architects that I long ago read about. But in whether these are LED and whether street lights are LED and whether we can, those are visible things. There are direct and indirect emissions, and there are layers and layers and layers of this. Think about this as beginning to peel the onion. So the more you think about it, the more questions you ask, the more deeper your solutions will be, and perhaps will answer your own questions. But the city doesn't work through these, it doesn't work as a transit system. It is, New York City is much more than the MTA. We would like to think the MTA has an impact on the city, but it's not everything that the city does. So the city comes together, and the city comes together not just on the base of climate. Climate was treated as a constant when cities were designed. It was an assumption that you tend to locate in a condition which had good weather compared to the surroundings, but that assumption has changed. But cities are battling a variety of other challenges. They have to deal with what the mayor will do in his first week of arrival, and then climate being a longer-term issue is competing with that. But this should not hold us back, because the efforts and actions of cities are demonstrating the antithesis of this assumption, which is that even though this is a long-term challenge, they are not legally required to act on this. They are reinventing themselves. The role of design in that is to magnify that and offer a transformational scale-up change that is indeed global in nature, affordable in every geography. If it's affordable for the slum dwellers in Lagos, it certainly will be affordable for the low-income households in New York. With that, I just want to say that there are like 3 broad takeaways from this. Cities are at high risk, but they also offer several opportunities of innovation. As Copenhagen shows us ample, as New York shows us ample, cities are homes, are laboratories for innovation. They are constantly reinventing themselves. You can magnify that by the choice that you have made. You sit in this room as a designer that already has long-term implications, because you're starting off as designers, you're starting off with this in the foreground of your priorities. And here, mapped for you, are efforts that are happening on campus by our very students, some sitting right between you. They have been picking cities around the world and applying the knowledge as they learn in school in reinventing the cities. So they craft the risk and they craft a response. And the brief is simple. If you pick Copenhagen, you have to do it better than what the city is doing now. That's the reason Ambassador Copenhagen doesn't feature here, because students don't know what else to add there, because Copenhagen is already right up there. And with that, I want to say thank you.